I'm Chris Richardson, and this is Not a Pipe podcast. Thank you very much for joining me today. I know a lot of us are wrapping up classes, maybe receiving or writing final essays, working on things for what seems like years, but only a few months since all of this has started with the pandemic. And I really appreciate listener support as well as the authors who have been willing to continue to do interviews and schedule them and talk to me. Today I am especially happy to be able to share with you my interview with Catherine A. Sanderson about her book, Why We Act, Turning Bystanders into Moral Rebels. Sanderson is the Manwell Family Professor of Life Sciences at Amherst College. She's written a number of important and influential books about mindset, happiness, health, many other psychology topics. I found this one in particular to be very practical on one level, but also very philosophical when we think about why people do the things that they do and sometimes allow the things to be done that nobody individually would want. And so it's really eye-opening, especially for me. I'm not a psychologist, I'm not well-versed in psychology, but I really enjoyed this and would encourage anyone else to check it out. Of course, don't forget to visit tinapp.org to see Sanderson's recommended readings, as well as all of those of earlier guests. And you can see what's in the pipeline to come in the next month or so. So Catherine, thank you again for being with me today. Maybe we can start with what your book is all about. For anyone who hasn't picked it up, how would you introduce the topic of moral rebels, and what does that even mean?
So what my book examines is a concept that I bet lots of people already do know, which is bystanders. So bystanders are basically people who watch and see something happen. And that could be somebody saying something offensive. It could be somebody engaging in some kind of bad behavior. Mm-hmm. And we all can think of times in which we've sort of observed, we've been a bystander and we haven't acted, or we've seen other people around us be watching but not actively intervening. So we call those people bystanders. And moral rebels are people who actually do something really brave, that they stand up, they challenge bad behavior, they call out bad action, and they basically try to put a stop to bad behavior of all types. And so my book is really designed to help people move from the much more common, probably human tendency to be a bystander, to push them instead to take action and become a moral rebel.
Reading it, it was refreshing to know that there are a number of studies that have been going on for a long time, but I'd say especially after the Second World War, where psychologists were interested in studying the behavior of people and conformity. And so you go through some of the older ones as well as much more recent ones. I'm wondering if there are any particular ones that stood out to you of key examples, especially I'm sure most listeners would be vaguely familiar with the Milgram experiments and these kinds of famous studies, but what are some of the key findings that psychologists have found over the last few decades that you think are probably the most important when thinking about this topic?
That's a really important question. And so first, I would say that you're absolutely right that probably most listeners, many people in the world remember from their intro psych class or popular press, the classic famous studies, the Milgram shock study about obedience, or studies showing that people, conform in different kinds of paradigms to other people. And I think there are two really interesting ways in which psychology has more recently extended those classic findings. One, there's actually been a much more thorough investigation of what happened in the so-called classic studies. So the Milgram study, of course, people remember that a person came in and they blindly, in theory, obeyed an authority to shock an innocent victim. Mm-hmm. But more recent examination of those transcripts and what happened actually provides much more nuanced findings that people, in fact, didn't blindly just continue. They actually really struggled with whether to continue or not. You actually can look at then, which people ultimately said, no, I won't continue, and what predicted people's willingness to continue versus willingness to stop. So I think that we've now learned a little bit more about the nature of that task and individual differences in ways that's really interesting. I think the other set of findings that people may be much less familiar with is much more recent research in the field of neuroscience that examines how we conform and obey and how that actually looks in terms of the brain responding. So at a very simple level, research has shown that experiencing physical pain, stepping on a hot sidewalk or burning your, forearm with coffee, actually feels painful at a physical level in precisely the same way that the brain processes social pain, such as being excluded from your group or made fun of. And so this research really tells us that physical pain and social pain, at least at a neurological level in the brain, actually feel the same, which I think provides really interesting insights that explain why most of us do tend to conform to people around us.
Yeah, I mean, that was one of definitely the most interesting things in reading your book, those kinds of studies that have been going on more recently. Maybe you could say a little bit more about the implications. So if people feel physical pain and social pain in a very similar way in their brains, how does that affect the decisions they make to step in or not step in?
So basically what that research tells us is that we really, really do not want to be excluded from our group, that being excluded from our social group, from people we care about, whether that's an athletic team or colleagues or fraternity brothers or whatever, we really don't want to be excluded. And so that leads us in some cases to not speak up. If somebody in our group is engaging in bad behavior, it becomes very, very hard to call them out on it because we worry that in fact we could experience some kind of consequence. We could be ostracized from the group. We could be ridiculed. And so that research helps explain why time and time again, we hear these horrific stories about all these people knew what was going on and no one stepped up, no one said anything. And this finding gives us an explanation for why that in fact is.
Yeah, and also I think one of the more interesting things was that people, when asked whether they would step in or whether they would respond in a certain way, gave, in some cases, very different answers to what actually happened in a sort of clinical experiment where people were in that situation. Maybe you could say a little bit about those kinds of findings and their implications as well.
Yes. So in what probably won't be surprising to many people, what we say we would do and what we actually do sometimes are not the same. Mm-hmm. So anyone who has ever made a New Year's resolution that, kind of had faded by February or March, can already think about that example in their own life. But time and time again, if you ask people, well, what would you do if, somebody made a sexually inappropriate comment to you during a job interview? Or what would you do if you saw somebody in need of help? Overwhelmingly, people imagine that they would be quite strong, that they would in fact speak up, they would call out the bad behavior, they would, do something very active to intervene. And yet when they actually put people in these situations and expose them to either, a physical altercation or a racist comment, most people, not everyone, but most people stay silent. So they anticipate they would behave courageously, but when push comes to shove and they're actually in that situation, most people do not respond, do not step up and call out that behavior.
Yeah, and what are some of the explanations that people have given for that kind of incongruence between what we say we would do and what we actually do?
So I think one of the challenges is that when we anticipate a situation occurring and we say, oh, well, I would respond in this way, we often imagine the situation as being clearer in our mind than it actually is. So lots of bad behavior actually can be somewhat ambiguous. So we might hear a comment and think, well, is that really offensive? Is that really sexist? I'm not really sure. And so therefore it becomes difficult in the moment to try to figure out how to respond. And so one real challenge is that many situations initially are somewhat ambiguous. So what do we do when situations are ambiguous? We look to other people around us. We try to look and see how they're responding. But the problem is if everybody around us is trying to act like, oh, I don't know what's going on, then we look to everybody else and basically it's like the blind leading the blind, that everybody is pretending that everything's okay. Here's a sort of classic example of that, which I think professors and students can relate to. Every time I teach a class, I say, are there any questions? And invariably, very, very few students, sometimes no students, will raise their hand and ask a question. And if you ask students, well, did you have a question? Many of them will say, oh, yeah, I did have a question. And then you say, well, why didn't you ask it? And they say, well, I didn't want to look stupid. And I had a question, but I looked around the room and nobody else was raising their hand. And so I assumed I must be the only one. And so there's a case where lots of people in that room probably did have a question, but lots of people in that room also failed to raise their hand because they didn't want to look stupid. But when they look at everybody else's behavior, not raising their hand, they don't think, oh, they just don't want to look stupid. They think they must not have any questions. And so that's an example about how our own behavior we see as driven by something entirely different than other people's behavior, even when in fact that behavior, not raising your hand in this example, is precisely the same.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. That was one of the examples that definitely resonated with me, and I'm sure a lot of other people. I'm wondering then, what as a professor, I mean, this is a sort of mundane example compared to some of the more serious ones, but yeah, if you have a classroom full of people who aren't raising their hand, even though they're all or many of them might have questions, they think everybody else understands and that they will look stupid if they put up their hand, but they're all in effectively the same situation. What do you recommend a professor do, or maybe a student do, to improve that situation? Because it doesn't seem like the ideal role for either group.
No, absolutely. And here's the key. The behavior in that case, although as you rightly note, is very mundane, not raising your hand in class, that exact phenomenon is what underlies inaction in all sorts of different situations. That in a locker room, somebody says something offensive and everybody in that room pretty much might be like, that's offensive, but nobody wants to be the person who calls out that behavior. Mm-hmm. So here's what's fascinating, and this is actually my own research that I've done in collaboration with my students, is that telling people that exact phenomenon. Hey, who remembers being in a class and not raising your hand because you don't want to look stupid? Everybody else is doing the same thing because they don't want to look stupid. Telling them that is actually really helpful. Exactly the same way that telling people, oh, you know what? Other people might have found that comment offensive as well, but they didn't want to call it out because they thought they would, they were the only one. So explaining to people the psychology that underlies our inaction across all sorts of situations. Why do you not call 911 when you have a friend who's seriously in trouble and unconscious from drinking? Why do you not raise your hand in class? Why do you not, help somebody who's in need? All of those examples actually involve trying to pretend that we feel one way and assuming that other people in a group do not. So really talking about the psychology underlying inaction gives people the tools to be able to step up and, for example, raise their hand, call 911, call out bad behavior, and so on. It's all rooted in the same psychological processes.
Introducing a lot of these topics, you give really interesting recent examples, like the doctor who was pulled out of a United Airlines flight while everybody watched. You give a number of recent things that we might see in the news about people not acting when it seemed to be very easy to act or necessary to act. And it seems, I think from one perspective, that this is becoming worse. We're seeing this kind of thing, like this inaction or this acceptance of what should be unacceptable behavior spreading out more, or people, I guess, fewer and fewer people rebelling or speaking out against that. That's not necessarily the case. And of course, I'm not saying that you're making that argument, but is there a reason that we might feel like things are getting worse in the sense of people not speaking out against issues?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because certainly I think anecdotally people do feel like it's getting worse. And I think one explanation potentially could be that the rise of social media really means that the consequences of acting may be stronger, so that people's behavior may stay with us longer. We may have more concerns about engaging in some kind of behavior that then is going to follow us. We may have particular need in terms of acting a certain way because of how our social media presence will be influenced. Now, I do think that can also cut in both ways, but certainly research has shown that in general, social media, when people are anonymous, can actually lead to much worse behavior overall because people, in fact, are not having to identify who they are and therefore experience consequences for that. But social media can be very difficult in terms of getting people to feel that others are watching them. And in fact, now there could be many, many more people, watching their behavior. And so the inherent risks of acting out and doing something and then feeling stupid or embarrassed may seem even more salient and risky.
Are there any ways to become more reflective about that and about the influences that might be, sort of pressing upon us in various ways. Like, I think if we're aware that our social media profiles could potentially at least be seen by employers, colleagues, people whose opinions we really care about and could affect us, I think, people would be much more cautious than if they were anonymous. But in day-to-day experience, it seems like we're being, I guess, presented with a lot of people whose opinions seem to make sense, or at least whose opinions it's not easy to challenge, or we don't see very many people challenging them, maybe because all of our friends are in a sort of similar group. What should we, I guess, be thinking of to make sure that when the situation calls for it, we can act as moral rebels?
So I think there are different solutions in different settings. And one of the things that I really hope to do in my book is to give people different tools, because the reality is that certain situations call for one kind of intervention and other situations call for different interventions. So I don't think it's a one size fits all solution. So I'll give a couple of examples. At the very most simplistic level, it's very clear that we are more likely to step up and act when we feel empathy for somebody else, when we feel connected to them in some way. And I think there's lots of research broadly in psychology showing that empathy really matters. So it's much easier to be rude to somebody, whether that's, a bully on the playground, et cetera, if you don't feel connected to them. And that is also a place where, social media can make it harder to feel empathy for other people, that we can feel, more distant from them. So on one level, trying to identify with what we have in common with somebody. Research studies have shown that even something as simple as sharing an affinity for the same sports team, for example, can make us more likely to step up and help somebody. So at a very basic level, feeling more empathy for somebody matters. I think it's also really important for parents to try to model morally courageous behavior for their children. So children learn by watching what other people do and being able to model taking difficult stands, standing up for what you believe in, making a hard choice, and talking about that is really important. And then finally, I'll point to something that perhaps seems very obvious, but that is, it's very hard to be the only person. It's very hard to stand alone, and that's just true for all of us. But it's much easier to stand with a friend. Even if you are deviating from the group, even if you are doing something that feels hard, it's much easier to do so if you have somebody supporting you and who shares your view. So I think one key thing is for people to try to talk to those they know, they care about, they trust, whether that's in their school, their college, their workplace, or so on. Because if you can find somebody else who feels the same about something, it's actually much easier to speak up and do the right thing.
Yeah, and I think, all of those situations can allow us, I guess, to become more well-versed in what to do in situations that call for us standing out or stepping up to something uncomfortable. You do speak about how, in a sense, practice is important. Hopefully people aren't in situations where they're always getting practice standing out and being moral rebels because, as we said, it's very draining. It can feel similar to, physical pain. So how do people practice that then, or what are some techniques?
So I think one of the challenges, as you just said, you could relate to the, student being in a college classroom and, not raising your hand or whatever. When I talk about this book with anyone, everybody has a story. I remember that time I was in a hotel ballroom. I remember that time I was in the stands of a hockey game. I remember that time I was at an airport. That everybody has stories about times that something happened and they failed to step up. And so what I'm really trying to do is give people a range of different skills so that you can pick the right strategy to use at a given time. And so it doesn't always mean being the courageous hero and standing up. There can be times in which very small gestures can be important. So an example could be if somebody says something offensive, instead of calling them out and saying, oh my gosh, that's terribly offensive, you can treat their comment as if it's a joke, or you can try to make some kind of empathy connection with them. So an example that I describe in the book is if you're, in a meeting or a class or, at the Thanksgiving dinner table and, somebody says something that's offensive, instead of having a big issue and, calling them out and saying, you're, a bigot or whatever, you could say something like, I know that you're just kind of joking about sexual assault, but, my best friend or my sister, experienced sexual assault. So I really, I really would wish you wouldn't make jokes about it. Or if somebody says, I could never vote for a woman president because women are too emotional to be president, instead of calling them out and saying, that's offensive, and of course women could be, et cetera, you could assume that they're joking, and you could say, ha ha, that's really funny. I know that you're just being sarcastic, but there are really some people who believe that. So really, you shouldn't make that comment. So there are ways in which you could lightly call out the behavior without kind of being the knight riding in on shining armor, being the strong moral rebel, that there are ways that you can do so subtly. And so my hope is that people will find different strategies and tools that they can use and they can practice. But honestly, the kind of strategy might differ depending on the situation and, frankly, the person who's using it, that there can be things that feel easier or harder to different people. And that's okay.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things as well was the ambiguity that is either present or not present in a situation will dramatically affect whether or not people step in. As you said, we all have our own examples. So I'm thinking of speaking to people, obviously, who are very different politically in what they're watching, who they're associating with, who they're voting for. And I'm just thinking a lot of the time we give examples where it's something to the effect of, somebody says something racist, how do you step in or what do you do to step in? And to me, like, that's obvious. There's no ambiguity in that, right? If somebody's saying a racial slur, it's not ambiguous in any way about who's good or who's bad. But I think in many cases, I'm thinking immigration, for example. So if somebody says something that I perceive as anti-immigrant, I'm really not ambiguous about that. I think they're probably xenophobes or what have you. But I can also kind of see that from their perspective, they think that maybe me and my liberal agenda is the problem because we're ruining the country or whatever. And so to them, they don't think it's ambiguous at all from the opposite perspective. And so, like, is there a bridging of the gap, or how do you suggest sort of approaching situations where, somebody says something about a woman not being able to be president, but they really do feel like it's a threat that women could be president or something, and they feel like they're doing the unambiguous thing by speaking out against you and your liberal agenda or something? Like, is there any way to engage, or are these groups sort of so far divided it's on almost beyond conversation?
So that's a really important question, and it's actually not an unusual question, that I think many of us, have pondered about. And here is my response: that if somebody truly and honestly believes, a woman could never be president, a woman is, too emotional to be president and, not able to do it, I don't believe that it's going to be very easy, and certainly this is not something that my book addresses, to change that person's mind. So my book is not about how do you, convince people of your, argument. Here's what I'm concerned about. If somebody says something, a woman can't be president, and you think it's dumb and wrong, and you don't say anything, then your silence in that situation is actually conveying that you too share the belief that a woman cannot be president with anybody who's sitting in that situation. So everybody who's listening, whether it's a class or a meeting or the Thanksgiving dinner table, silence tends to indicate agreement and acquiescence. So my thought in that situation is not that you're trying to change the person's mind who believes that a woman can't be president. My thought is that if you believe a woman can be president, you have an obligation to say, you may really believe that, Uncle Tim, but the reality is, I think a woman absolutely could be president. And here's why. And therefore you are modeling an alternative viewpoint, and you are showing in that environment, in that room, to other people that you actually disagree with that view. And so I think one of the most important things is for us to be able to voice alternative views, because so often people, in fact, do stay silent. And that leads the behavior to continue, because the person who made the sexist comment is then going to say, yeah, nobody spoke up. I guess everybody agrees with me. So that's really where what I'm trying to get into is helping people be able to voice opinions that can seem hard and deviant in the moment.
Mm-hmm, yeah. And I think, as you said, that's a really important thing, is to let somebody who, believes that a woman couldn't be president know at least that there are people, significantly, hopefully, that disagree with that perspective. If you extrapolate that and think about, social media connections and the fact that a lot of groups are sort of just echo chambers, does that mean that it's going to be inevitably harder to have those kind of conversations? If we're in a situation like the metaphorical Thanksgiving dinner where our Uncle Tim is saying something, and silence in that case could be seen as agreement, and therefore it may indeed be a good time to at least voice some challenges to that kind of sentiment. how do we extrapolate that when it comes to social media, where people may be under the impression that virtually everyone in the world or everyone in their country agrees with them because effectively all their friends are, Republican or Democrat or part of this group or that group. In that sense, while I think I understand the conversational aspect, it seems like you could be forever voicing opinions online, and it could be clearly a trap in many ways. Do you have any thoughts about how we might maybe improve the situation or think about social media in a way that's different from the conversation at the family table?
Yeah, so I think the challenge with social media is twofold. I think one challenge is that often people, as you noted, are friends on social media with other people who share their exact same viewpoint, whether that's, political or religious, or moral or whatever. And so the challenge is there may not be times in which you need to actually speak up because everyone, in fact, is voicing the same opinion. So it's the sort of echo chamber. Mm-hmm. But I also think there are times, even on social media, in which people say things and you actually disagree, but you fail to speak up because maybe you think a person has said something too far, or maybe you think that person has really gone to an extreme. And yet you're worried, if I speak up, other people will gang up on me. Other people, will not imagine, that they want me in this group in some way. And even in settings in which you generally feel the same as other people, it can still be hard to speak up and say, well, I actually, really think this person, didn't do a good thing, et cetera. And I think we can see that playing out very clearly, on Twitter and so on, in which somebody voices something kind of contrarian, and then all of a sudden, they're sort of viciously attacked.
Yeah, and that seems to be more and more the case. And also, I think it seems to be more and more predictable, right? All you need to know is the political party of somebody who says something, and you kind of know who's going to say yes for sure and who's going to say absolutely not. The conversation it's not a conversation, right? It's just sort of, an echo chamber, like you said. Is there a way out of it in terms of communicating online, or is it best served to sort of maybe focus on more immediate group settings?
I think it's always easier to do it when there's less anonymity. So it's far easier on social media because we're not sitting in a room with somebody. And that's kind of why I gave the example of the Thanksgiving dinner table. Mm-hmm. On social media, you might be arguing with somebody who's not even, an actual person, right? I mean, you could be arguing with a bot, for example. And so I think, and it's much easier for people to be mean. It's much easier for people to attack and to be aggressive. Again, it's the opposite of empathy because you're not looking at the person. So it's much easier to be cruel. It's much easier to not really pay attention to them and frankly, to misunderstand things like sarcasm. So I do think all of this is better served if it happens live. Ideally, again, in settings in which you can then feel some kind of empathy and some kind of connection to the actual person and not just to sort of your belief of that person and your stereotype about who he or she is.
Yeah, no, and I think that's valuable advice because we can easily get sort of trapped in unproductive conversations or actions. When we do, I guess, start to think about our situation or our place and whether or not we should respond or how best to respond, are there questions in your mind that are best asked of ourselves when we're considering whether or not we should say something? I mean, as you said, if silence can be seen as acquiescence or a tacit agreement, but yeah, if we're not sure, especially in a somewhat ambiguous situation, are there sort of questions you would recommend us reflecting on as we're deciding, I guess, whether to intervene or whether to, not worry about this particular thing?
So I had a really interesting conversation a few days ago on another podcast interview. And the person referred to what happens in meetings. And he said, so often you're in a meeting and somebody's saying something and you totally disagree with it, but you don't say anything. And then afterwards, and what he called it was the after party, which I thought was just a funny term. So he described the after party is when the people who were at the meeting but stayed silent all gathered together and they're like, could you believe that person said that? Or could you believe that was a decision? Or could you believe whatever? And I think we've all been there. I mean, I had never heard that expression, the after party, describing a meeting, but I absolutely resonated with that. And of course, to the extent that that's happening, that is describing exactly the situation that I'm setting out in my book, that people are in a situation, some decision is being made or somebody is saying something. Everybody privately is thinking, oh no, or oh gosh, or that's not good. And yet those conversations are happening at the after party. They're not happening in the moment. And so what I think is really important for us to recognize again is that we're all in that situation. We're all in that situation where it's just us. We assume it's just us, but it's absolutely not. And so I think trying to dip your toe into that water. And so I've now made it a habit of, if I'm in a meeting and I really disagree with something that's being said, I will often say something like, hey, I'm not trying to derail us. It might just be me, but I really think that this is not the right way to go for X, Y, and Z. And if others disagree, that's totally fine. But I just wanted to put that out there. And so therefore, I haven't said I'm going to ruin the whole meeting. I'm going to just derail the discussion. But I'm going on the record as saying, yeah, I'm not really comfortable with this. And to me, that then allows other people permission, because sometimes what you need is one person to speak up. I mean, we can think of, classic legal courtroom dramas in which, one juror manages to, persuade the other 11 to vote a certain way. But the reality is that kind of plays out in lots of different situations. And what you need is one person to be willing to speak up, and understanding that even though it might feel really scary and like you're the only one, in many cases, when one person speaks up, other people are like, oh yeah, I was feeling the same way, or oh yeah, I totally agree. You just need somebody to start that discussion.
Yeah, I think that's valuable. As you continue to, do research and think about these questions that you raise in this book, I'm wondering if you have any advice for people. I mean, for me, while I'm reading some of these studies, some of which I'd been familiar with earlier, some I hadn't, of course, but I read about conformity and I think, what horrible societies we live in. Like, all of these people are just conformist. I'm probably a conformist. This is really bad, depending on the study, of course. And then I hear other stories about somebody, who was a great civil rights activist who managed to speak out against whatever the case was that they were part of. And, and then that gives me great hope in society. And I seem to sort of go back and forth depending on the kind of study I read. I don't know if everybody has that kind of situation, but I'm wondering if while you're doing your research, you're thinking about moral rebels and kind of, looking at the best and worst examples. How do you put that all together? And is there a way of not, I guess, getting too emotionally attached to the situation that you're studying?
Yeah, I will say I am very emotionally attached. I'm going to admit that. And I'm going to say that working on this book, I found myself constantly stopping and asking people if they needed help. I remember a case, sort of midway through the writing process, I was in the Atlanta airport and I was in that bottom part, where you're going between the different trams. Mm-hmm. And there was an older man vomiting into a trash can and a woman beside him, who I assume was his wife. And I walked past them. And about 10 feet after I walked past them, I was like, oh, I'm one of those people who just, walked by. And I literally stopped, turned around and walked back and was like, ma'am, may I get you some help? May I do something? And she was, very appreciative and asked if I could go find somebody with a wheelchair and, et cetera. So I will say that it has become, of course, very personally relevant for me. But what I will say that I think is actually the most important takeaway is that all of the factors that lead us to engage in bad behavior, and you and I have talked about a lot of them, all of those factors can be flipped to lead us to engage in good behavior. And I'll just give you a couple really short, simple examples. But one very clever study was done in a hotel, literally in a hotel. And they had some people in the hotel rooms, the hotel guests, read a little sign that said, Mother Earth is really important. Please reuse your towels. We've all seen those signs. Another group of people saw a little sign that said, 85% of hotel guests reuse their towels because they care about Mother Earth. And so there's a case where people actually say, I care about Mother Earth, but the reality is the sign saying other people care about Mother Earth led to far higher rates of reusing towels than just saying care about Mother Earth. So there's a case where learning other people care about Mother Earth leads you to be more environmentally conscious. Another classic study was done by political scientists at Yale. And what they found is that telling people, hey, most of your neighbors vote, led to far greater voter turnout than to telling people things like voting is a civic responsibility, or you're an American, you should vote, or even here are your polling place and hours. So those are cases in which social norms, social pressure can actually lead us to do the right thing, can lead us to be more environmentally conscious, can lead us to be more politically engaged. And so all of the factors that help us push towards silence in certain cases can actually be used to help us engage in positive and pro-social behavior in the exact same way.
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking about those examples as well because they're very clearly linked to better voter turnout or more environmentally friendly practices in hotels. And it seems to be, the equivalent of peer pressure, right? So everybody is recycling, you should recycle too, can be an effective thing, but it can also be, a bad thing if people are using peer pressure in the more sort of classic negative sense where they're saying, everybody hates so-and-so, you should hate them too. Is there a way to sort of negotiate when you may be feeling some kind of pressure and making a decision that's more well-informed, I think, morally? Because it seems like if you can be manipulated into voting, you can also be manipulated into voting against your interests. If they're saying something like, 90% of people are voting for this guy, who's evil, you should too. I mean, it's never that clear, of course, but it seems like peer pressure can be a source of good and bad. Can we distinguish, or is it always going to be affecting us depending on who's telling us this stuff?
So you're absolutely right. And peer pressure can absolutely, the exact same factors that can lead us to reuse our towel or to vote more can also be used to, increase fraternity hazing or, as you note, vote for somebody who's not particularly going to make policy that you would agree with. But what I will say I think is extraordinarily important and is consistent across studies is that any factor that increases people's self-awareness, so sense of who they are, anything that increases your sense of yourself as a person tends to lead you to engage in more positive behavior for other people. So having self-awareness reduces aggression, reduces bullying, reduces offensive language, and so on, reduces dishonesty. So I talk about a couple of examples, having college students sign their name before they take an exam reduces cheating. Having people who are filling out their insurance forms to get car insurance report higher mileage, presumably more honestly, if they sign their name at the top of the form than the bottom of the form. Posting a pair of eyes above the, donate money when you take a cup of coffee at the office leads you to, in fact, donate more money than if you don't have that pair of eyes. So all of those examples are things suggesting that I believe most people are good. Now, so my book does not examine, psychopaths or sociopaths or whatever, but I believe most people are good and that most people want to behave pro-socially and don't want to harm other people and sometimes do harm other people because they're in a situation in which they feel peer pressure to do so. But I believe fundamentally most people are good, and that what we need to do is to create environments in which that good behavior can shine. And one of the clear findings in lots of research is that greater self-awareness, having a sense of yourself as a person, leads most of us to behave in a better way, whereas having a sense of being lost in a group, being anonymous, and so on, leads most of us, even the good people, to behave less well.
Yeah, I'm curious actually, in your own life as a teacher, as a researcher, as somebody interacting with others, I know that you've studied this stuff for a long time, much longer than just this book itself took to write. In researching and thinking about these issues, are there elements of your own behavior that have changed since learning new things? For example, you said that like accepting from other students that they're not putting up their hand and letting them know that, a lot of other students are also probably not putting up their hand because they think you think that they're stupid, but you're all thinking the same thing, and therefore maybe more hands go up after learning that. Are there other things that you've done or begin to consider in your own, instruction or lectures or what have you?
It's made me very conscious of my own behavior in lots of different settings. So I do talk about that finding very clearly with college students who I teach in my classes. I gave the example before of how I am in meetings, that I understand in a meeting that if I have a concern about something, there are probably a lot of other people in that room who also have a concern and aren't saying it. So I don't assume that it's just me. And that actually makes it easier for me to speak out because my assumption is a lot of other people are also inhibited from speaking out in the exact same way. It's also changed how I am on social media. So I think there's a tendency for lots of people on, Instagram or Facebook or whatever to talk only about their successes, to talk about what is good and to sort of present themselves in a certain way. And it's made me much more conscious of making sure that I'm sharing the bad as well as the good. Because again, I think that makes it harder for people to accept authenticity, if everything they see on social media is glowing, that can make all of us feel worse about ourselves. So all of that is sort of what I'm interested in, is the gap between the public and the private, what we present to other people versus how I really feel inside. And that to me is what's particularly interesting, as well as research by, myself, my students, but also other people, showing that helping people understand that psychology is extraordinarily important in helping them overcome these natural factors that can make us feel inhibited from acting, even when we'd like to do so.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting studies that you mentioned in the book is about young students who are exposed to sexual harassment training or discrimination, where on a very, very basic level, I can't remember how old these students were, but it sounded like, they were quite young, and it was simply that, making fun of boys or girls for doing what's perceived as a boy thing or a girl thing is bad, and you should speak up about this, significantly changed how students would act around each other. I'm wondering if you see, or if you would like to see, certain programs or certain ideas implemented, maybe, starting from kindergarten, but all the way up to anyone, adults. Are there certain things that you think would significantly benefit society if we only taught certain lessons or did certain things?
Absolutely. And that's a wonderful question, because the reality is that if we can start helping little kids, so that study was actually done even with kids as young as kindergarten. If we can start with little kids talking about, hey, these are these factors that inhibit us from taking action. Here are some skills you can use when somebody makes a, sexist comment. Those skills we can actually continue to use. So if we trained people in elementary school and middle school, they would be able to use those skills in high school. They would be able to use those skills in college. They would be able to use those skills beyond, because the same skill set about understanding this public versus private reality, the idea that everybody actually feels inhibited, giving people skills that they need to speak up and do the right thing. If we can teach people how to do that initially, those skills are long lasting and they apply to many, many diverse situations that we're in.
I mean, what would you like to see? If you could, I mean, obviously we can't do it easily, but if you could say, we're going to start implementing this program where we teach these kinds of skills, where would it best serve us? And I mean, would it be primarily in the lower grades so that it translates up? Or would you like to see maybe, kids in kindergarten learning how to speak up a little bit, but also high school students receiving a certain more maybe nuanced lesson or something?
I mean, what I think is that if at a core level, people had the understanding of the human condition of not wanting to speak out against your group and why it's hard, and giving people the tools to do that. And I think that is fundamentally the important lesson. Then I think, as you note, that the nature of that lesson might need to change over time. So in elementary school, it might be about speaking out against bullying, and that could include verbal aggression or physical aggression. In high school, it might be speaking out against sexual misconduct or alcohol hazing. In college, it might be speaking out against, again, fraternity hazing, sexual misconduct. It could also be academic plagiarism. I think workplaces need to really emphasize the importance of helping people speak up and call out bad behavior, whether that's sexual misconduct or offensive language or corporate fraud, because on all of those different dimensions, the psychology is the same, but understanding how that psychology applies to something that's personally relevant gives us a better training in how to understand our own behavior, other people's behavior, and what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm just thinking about our current situation, and I don't like to ask a lot of speculation questions, but I'm going to ask one, and we'll see. But
okay,
you can answer in whatever way you like. But it sounds to me like a lot of the psychological studies that came after the Second World War were really trying to figure out, how could Nazism spread so easily, especially if a number of the people partake in really horrible things were not really horrible people themselves, in meaning like they were normal people in a situation as opposed to monsters. And so there's been a lot of psychological experiments, studies, sociological studies about how we could have that in our world. And then, there's the idea that never again would we let that happen. And yet we see in a number of places, Rwanda, the genocides in Bosnia, in more recent histories, bad things happening. And so it seems like while we never want these kinds of things to happen, they do sort of continue to happen in various places. What are the factors that you would encourage us to look for or worry about to make sure that something like that doesn't happen? Because I'm just thinking, Charlottesville, we have these sort of neo-Nazis doing horrible things that fit very nicely into the sort of psychological studies that we've seen, right? When there's a sort of authoritative leader, they don't feel that they're personally responsible. They seem to be part of a group that all seems to feel the same way. While we would love to say that, something like the Second World War and the rise of Nazis would never happen, it seems like it could very easily happen given the right circumstances. So I'm not asking you to predict if there would be another world war of that size, but would there be a possibility for Americans to start doing bad things en masse, and how would we want to avoid that, or what would we look out for?
Yeah, so unfortunately, I agree that the conditions that led to Nazi Germany seem frankly far too familiar and easy to imagine occurring. And I guess the shortest answer to that is I address in the final chapter of the book, and that is sweat the small stuff. And it's sweat the small stuff because the reality is that evil behavior often doesn't happen all of a sudden in a grand way. That often evil behavior occurs in a very gradual, subtle way, and that actually makes it much more difficult to call out. So Nazi Germany did not start by putting Jewish people on train cars and taking them to concentration camps and killing them. Nazi Germany started with very, very small steps. We're going to disbar Jewish doctors and lawyers. We're going to make Jewish people live in a certain part of town. We're going to make Jewish people wear stars. So it starts with these very, very small steps, and that makes it harder for people to identify, is this really evil behavior? And I use the example in the book of, the classic story of the boiling water frog effect. So if you pop a frog into a pan of boiling water, it will immediately pop out and live. But if you put a frog in a bucket of cold water and then you gradually, over time, heat it up, it will never realize it until it's too late, and it will in fact boil to death. And so I think the one piece of advice that we all really need to remember is it's really important to sweat the small stuff. So if something doesn't feel right initially in your workplace, in your home, in your fraternity, in your athletic team, whatever, it's really important to speak out at that moment and to not wait.
Yeah, no, and I think that's a really important, lesson from your book that is very clear by the end of it, just how important some of these seemingly small things can be. I don't want to end like that, though. I want to talk just as we start to wrap up about maybe some of your favorite or most inspiring stories that you've come across when, thinking about actual moral rebels, maybe recently, maybe more historically, but who comes to mind or what events come to mind that you think are great examples?
Well, so one thing that was actually, I thought, very hopeful in working on this book is that even in cases in which we hear, oh my gosh, everybody did this or everybody did this, there are always moral rebels. And so in the Milgram study, what people remember is, oh yeah, all those people, willingly gave shocks to an innocent victim. And that is true, but it was not true for everybody. And there were absolutely people who said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm stopping. In cases in which we've seen fraternity hazing and lots of fraternity brothers failing to get help, there are isolated examples of members of a fraternity who say, hey, this is a problem and I'm going to go get help, or I'm going to call 911. And even if that means you hate me, I'm going to do the right thing. We see that very clearly in the present day of people who are so-called whistleblowers, who in fact do speak out and do the right thing. And sometimes they pay consequences for it immediately, but often with the history and how we see that act over time, they really become heroes. And so what I'm really interested in is understanding what are the characteristics of people who do step up and call out bad behavior, and what can we learn from those people about trying to foster that in ourselves and in other people around us.
Yeah, and actually one thing we didn't quite touch on yet is the idea of mindset. And it was interesting to hear that people who believe that you can change are much more likely to try to step in and make a situation better, whereas people who feel like people are set in their ways, they're not going to change ever, or people are not going to change their minds, are much less likely to actually try to change people's minds. So maybe you could say something about the importance of mindset and how that plays into this.
Well, because I think it's really important for us to recognize that there is hope, So I didn't just write this book so that people would be like, oh my gosh, we're all so horrible. People are bad. And in all honesty, there are a lot of examples in the book of people are bad. But the reality is that believing in the power of change, believing in the power that knowledge is in fact helpful, and all of the research studies suggest that understanding the psychology that leads us to not step up helps us do something. And that, of course, is fundamentally the power of change. That maybe you haven't been a moral rebel in the past, but you could be. Many of us have had times in which we've seen something, we've heard something, we've stewed about it, and 24 hours later, we come up with the perfect response that we've, of course, missed the boat on doing. And so my hope is that this book will give people insight into their own behavior. They will understand that they can change how they've acted in the past, and that they will gain tools and strategies for how to not wait 24 hours next time before stepping up and saying something or doing something.
Yeah, it actually reminds me of I think it's Marcel Proust who had this idea of l'esprit d'escalier, which is, you have this interaction at the top of the stairs. By the time you get down the stairs, you're like, oh, I had the perfect comeback, or I definitely should have said this. And I think, at the very least, one of the things that this book will help people with is avoiding that feeling, because you're more likely to act knowing how things work and the psychology behind it. No, I really appreciate you talking to me today, Catherine. I'm just curious, before we go, if you could say a little bit about where your research is taking you now. Are you going to continue in a lot of the things that you've been talking about in the book, Why We Act, or maybe you're moving in a different direction?
So I would say there's sort of two things that I am focused on now. One, and again, I'm a college professor, and as people I'm sure have heard about, there's a real epidemic of anxiety, depression, loneliness on college campuses. Mm-hmm. I teach at a very small college, about 1,700 students, and in 2018, we lost 2 students to suicide. And so my most recent research in collaboration with my thesis students has been examining how can we take what we know from the field of social psychology and this public versus private gap and social norms, and how can we use it to give people tools to be able to step up when they are struggling with mental health issues themselves, or when they have a friend, teammate, et cetera, who may be struggling. So I'm really interested in examining how we can apply the lessons from this book specifically to the area of mental health. I think the other factor that I'm very interested in, and I have not really started working on this, but I'm very interested in understanding who are the moral rebels. So in chapter 9 of my book, Why We Act, I do describe what are their traits, what are their characteristics, but I think there's lots of interesting future work to be done by me and others to examine what makes a moral rebel. Are moral rebels born? Is it something you're born with, genetically? Is it birth order? Is it personality? Is it early life experiences? And I'm very interested in that process of what does explain why some people seem to be able to speak up and do the right thing when so many of us cannot, and what's different about those people, and where does that come from?
Yeah, it sounds great. You're clearly doing work that, is serious and can be quite daunting, I imagine, but is also very inspiring in terms of what we can learn from it and how we can treat other people.
Thank you for those kind words. And really, my goal in writing this book was to help people behave differently. That was really my goal, that giving people this insight. And so I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to talk about it.
Well, I do very much appreciate it. And thank you again. As always, thank you so much for listening to and supporting This Is Not a Pipe podcast. I hope everyone is doing as well as they possibly can be during these times. I very much appreciate people continuing to retweet and repost and share these interviews, as well as feedback. Despite some very significant challenges, I've still very much enjoyed being able to speak to people about the work that they're doing, such as Catherine Sanderson and others who are doing really incredible research, and I'm happy to be a part of that conversation. Be sure to check out tinap.org to see all of our authors' recommended readings, as well as their profiles and information about what's to come. Stay safe, stay positive, and of course, intervene when the occasion presents itself. As Dr. Sanderson says, silence tends to indicate agreement and acquiescence, which is something I think we can't do, especially in certain times like these. Until next time, I'm Chris Richardson. Cheers.